But the first thing that we wanted to do in this session is to give an overview of what we understand about patterns and trends. And before I do that, this slide actually was meant to go a little bit earlier, I do particularly want to acknowledge the conference organising team from NCETA who's been involved with this program of work that we've put together for you. So Alan Triffanoff and Stacey Appleton, who I think all of you probably have had contact with at this stage now. The conference program committee that comprised myself and Nicole Lee and Robert Arlai, and our logistical team with Dr. Alice McKenty, Ken Pidd and Jane Fisher and Victoria Konstantinov. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the contribution and support from the Australian Government Department of Health for their funding of NCETA. So moving on. So if we think in terms of what the current context is like for us, we know that there's this increasing level of concern in Australia about methamphetamine use, which is often framed and used synonymously for ice, with the term ice. We certainly have seen very strong media interest, and our own media people at Flinders University put together a press release for us last week describing an epidemic of negative headlines. And that's one of the issues that we're wanting to deal with today. To what extent is the hype and rhetoric borne out in reality? And how do we understand that, and how do we interpret and then convert that into appropriate responses? We also know that there has been increasing pressure on health and community services to respond appropriately, and we want to look very carefully at how those services are best able to respond to the needs of people who are experiencing problems with their methamphetamine use. So in this presentation, I want to give a bit of an overview of the current data to inform our understanding of patterns and problems, and certainly how that will inform potential responses. But as I said, the data will only provide part of the insight and the understanding that we really do require. It's a much broader understanding that we're trying to get here that we will be able to extract simply from data. And we also are aware of the needs of communities and families and users and service providers and their inputs and their perspectives to complement our understanding with the best available data that we've got, and we will do that throughout the day as well. So some of the key questions and considerations, and let me go back to kind of Drugs 101 and first principles for a moment and talk about, well, what is methamphetamine, what is ice? And that's important, I think, because of some of the conflating that's occurred around those issues. And the question that's, I think, uppermost in all of our minds is, well, what has changed so very recently and so very rapidly? And is it a real change? What are the things that we should be concerned about most? Who's most likely to experience problems with their methamphetamine use? And then what are the best evidence-based intervention options available to us? That last question will be addressed throughout the day, and particularly as we move into the workshops as well. So, as we would know, methamphetamine belongs to the stimulant class of drugs, which includes amphetamine, ecstasy and cocaine. These types of drugs stimulate brain and central nervous system activity and can result in a range of physiological and psychological changes. And so some of them are the more attractive and desirable things, such as increased alertness, euphoria, energy, enhanced mood. And then often there's a downside. There can be effects in terms of anxiety, panic, agitation, hallucinations, aggression, violence, and so forth. And I think one of the big differences for us in the sector dealing with people who have problems around stimulants is how different that is to the problems encountered, say, particularly through the 1990s, when heroin as a central nervous system depressant was our main drug of preoccupation. And many of our services have been geared to cater much more for people who have problems with depressants, such as alcohol and opioids, than they are with stimulants. So I think there's an underpinning challenge in that regard. In terms of the forms of methamphetamine, there's essentially three different forms. So powder or speed, which was the dominant form in which methamphetamine was used until relatively recently, and base, or the crystalline form, ice. And so that's the one that's created so much controversy of late. So the particular concerns around the crystalline form, or ice, and that's received so much media attention, raises a series of questions. Well, why is that the case? Several reasons, multiple reasons that help us to understand what's driving this concern at the moment. And one is that when methamphetamine is used in its ice form, it's one of the purest forms that's available. So people are often getting a much higher concentration of the psychoactive substances involved. Number one. Number two, it's often and increasingly smoked. which means it passes the blood-brain barrier much more quickly and you get the hit much more quickly. And as we all know, that these are things that will lead to reinforcement of that particular behaviour, and if you keep doing it frequently enough, the increased propensity for developing dependence. So 2 particular concerns to start with. So some of the other things that we know that have changed very recently as well, and some of the things that drive all our concerns around any drug type, is price, and price has significantly decreased while availability has increased. Purity has also significantly increased. The form, slide's got a little jiggly there, the form, we've seen this shift away from powder and tablet form to ice, and the mode of administration increasingly where it's smoked. And as you'll see in some of this data, that for a substantial and a significant proportion of users, the frequency of use has also gone up. All of these, no matter what substance we were speaking about, all of these would be issues of concern for us. Some of the work that has been done here recently in Victoria has really stressed and highlighted for us the importance around and empirically recorded the very strong increase in purity and the decline in the purity adjusted price per gram. And on any measure for any substance, that would be a concern. But the other thing Scott and Al highlighted for us was also that there was extreme purity variation, which is a real risk for users. And so that's also something that's likely to be contributing to some of the additional harms we might be seeing. And similarly with the Australian Crime Commission report that came out recently, the other thing that was highlighted, that there's been big changes in terms of the supply and the drivers and the underlying criminality involved with the production, manufacture and distribution of methamphetamine and ice in Australia. So we've moved away from it being to a large extent homegrown and home-produced to being a product imported largely from Asian countries, particularly China. So the external dynamic has changed really substantially for us. So if we're to look initially to answer this question about, well, what is the pattern of use around methamphetamine and ice in Australia like at the moment? What's changed? Is it different? We can go to multiple sources. We can go to and I'm not devaluing at all the anecdotal information. Much of our understanding comes from either our Sentinel databases or our frontline workers who say, we're suddenly seeing overdoses for this substance here, or we're seeing changes here, and we're particularly sensitive to that kind of input. But some multiple sources. There's certainly been a lot of media input, as I'd mentioned. A lot of observation from various key players. Service providers in particular are reporting to us huge changes in the nature and face of the clientele that they're seeing, as have law enforcement. But what I'll do for just this particular session is to refer back to the hard nuts and bolts of data that we've got at the moment from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. I'll have a little look also at the national minimum data set from the alcohol and drug treatment specialists, and also we pulled a little bit of data from the hospital separations, morbidity data. Some of the other data that's available to us, Paul Dietz in the next session will talk about, that's also extremely informative, that comes particularly from user groups, so the IDRS, the EDRS, some of the ED data and some of the other targeted specific studies. So Australia, as I said at the outset, we are strong players in the alcohol and drug sector, and we have very good data sets. None of them are perfect, but we have very good data to inform our understanding of what the situation is and what our best strategies and interventions might look like. So, if we have a look at, is a laser here? Yes. If we have a look at what the National Household Drug Strategy tells us about methamphetamine use in Australia, the black line is the total. Males and females, the typical 2-to-1 ratio of use. I'm going to come back to that issue about gender in a little bit though. But just follow the black line through, and what you'll see is the overall national prevalence of methamphetamine use is running at around 2% and has done for the last couple of years. It's nearly half of what it was in 1998. And on the basis of that, you would think, what problem? And it does sort of look like that if you just look at that particular piece of data there. several things though. The population size has actually increased between about 98 and 2013. I think the population increased by about 4 million. And if you just took that period of time there, there's probably about an increase of 1 million or 1.5 million. So the number of people in that 2% that are likely to be using would have increased. So that's another thing to factor into it. Percentages on their own are helpful but limited. But there are many other things that have changed within that pattern. Oops, too enthusiastic. So the next thing to look at is then, well, who's using and how are they using, how frequently are they using? And as we know, for any psychoactive substance, the frequency of use is absolutely crucial to the types of problems that might be encountered. And that's not to say that using infrequently is without problem. We know that young people can overdose and die, not being a regular user of alcohol, but downing a bottle of spirits very quickly. So infrequent use does not necessarily mean no problems. It means different sorts of potential problems. But frequency of use invariably means a higher risk of problem. So what we see is that about 2/3, so this is looking at the household survey data from 2007, 10 and 13. It's conducted every 3 years, as you'd all know. 2013 data says about 2/3, more than 2/3, close to 70% of people use yearly. They might use a couple of times throughout the year, less than monthly. So that group is not a very frequent group of users, and we'll look at those in a little bit more detail, more specifically. But this is the thing that's changed. This is a statistically significant increase between 2010 and 13. So in a really short period of time, and we don't see this very often in our sector, mostly trends and patterns are fairly smoothish, but that's a statistically significant increase in the number of people who are using weekly. So that's another issue of concern for us. So weekly use, concern. The other thing that's very interesting is this is the traditional pattern of illicit drug use in Australia, a 2-to-1 ratio of males and females, and you see yearly users, monthly users, 2-to-1. What we see now with weekly users, though, is the gender balance is about the same. So there are more women who are now using methamphetamine on a frequent basis. Now, women are a vulnerable population in a variety of different ways, but that's an unusual pattern, and that's a concerning pattern as well. So that's another reason for concern. We also then looked, in that period of time, in terms of the form of methamphetamine that was used. And so what we saw was, again, a statistically significant increase from about 1 in 5 using ice in 2010 to about half. So it's now become the preferred form of methamphetamine. So this is 2013, and anecdotally and other data would suggest that that trend has probably increased and continued in the last 12 or 18 months as well. So real data and a real reason for concern, no question about that. The other issue is the mode of administration, and again, in 2007-10, only a small proportion of people smoked methamphetamine, but now that's up to around 40%. And because, as I say, the psychoactive substance passes the blood-brain barrier much more quickly, you're going to get a hit more quickly, and that increases risks of all different sorts. So real changes of real significance for us. The other thing that we then looked at was, well, amongst the ice users in the group of methamphetamine users, what's changed in terms of age since 2007, 10 and 13? And what we see is a statistically significant decrease in the age of ice users. Now this is important because one of our speculations has been, well, perhaps it's only been the pool of people who'd been using methamphetamine for a period of time and they've moved over to ice. There's a couple of things that suggest that that probably is the case in many instances, but perhaps not in all instances. The decrease in age doesn't look like a lot, but that's statistically significant and trending down, whereas for methamphetamine users overall, it's in the other direction. They're an older group, they're in their 30s, they're more mature, they tend to be employed and married and so forth. Different group. So age is another flag for us in terms of vulnerability of users and an indication of areas where there might be an exacerbation of problems. We then said, okay, well, what does it look like if you separate out the yearly users, the infrequent users, for both meth, and the data in brackets is for ICE users, and the frequent users, those who use at least on a weekly basis or at least monthly, for meth overall and ICE in brackets. And you see really different profiles between these two groups. Incredibly important for how we think about the kinds of interventions, programs and treatment options that we want to provide, because these are really two very different sets of individuals. The yearly users, the proportion of males is higher, which is interesting in itself. Much higher proportion, about a third are married, most of them are employed, vast majority are heterosexual. They live in cities. The city-rural issue, and I know there's huge issues about problems in rural areas, and I don't think this is very sensitive data in that regard. But they're mostly not psychologically distressed, and this is measured by the K10, and you see the brackets here is the ICE users, that less than 1 in 5 are demonstrating indicators of psychological distress, which is counterintuitive considering other data we've looked at. They tend not to work under the influence. They do take drugs and drive. And so that's a real concern for us. That happens at quite a high level. But amongst the frequent users, a lower proportion of males, fewer of them are married, less than half of them are employed, fewer of them are heterosexual. So there's a sexuality kind of component to this here. So that's an important thing for us to be aware of. And in terms of groups in the population who are vulnerable, the city issue I'd mentioned, but a high proportion of them are experiencing psychological distress, and particularly those who are weekly or monthly ICE users, very high levels of psychological distress. And again, many of them have either worked or driven under the influence of the drugs that they're taking. But this is an indication of how we can start to look more closely at in a more nuanced way at the data that we have available to inform the strategies that we think might be appropriate from a prevention and treatment perspective. So this is, to a large extent, just starting to scratch the surface of it. But in essence, it looks like this. So that the less frequent yearly users, they tend to be employed heterosexual male, and using it with low levels of psychological distress. These are not likely to be treatment seekers, but it does not mean that their use is without risk, and we do need to think particularly about the kinds of interventions that might be appropriate for those groups, because infrequent use can be associated with a series of harms, number one. But number two, what we don't want is to see a drift from infrequent to frequent use, so that there's great opportunity for intervention here with this group. Conversely, the frequent users of methamphetamine users, including ICE, tend to comprise more females, less likely to be married and fewer heterosexuals, and are also more likely to be unemployed. There's more at the bottom of that slide, which I can't see. More psychologically distressed and great risk takers as well. So that's what the household survey is starting to tell us. So clear, concrete, tangible shifts and changes in trends and patterns of use. And we do need to look at it more carefully and drill into it. But then we said, okay, what's it looking like for the treatment providers? So we looked at the national minimum data set. And so what you see here is in terms of presentations for methamphetamine, it's a little bit tricky because you can't drill down into it and disaggregate for meth, any forms of meth. And in Victoria, you can't actually identify meth specifically. But what we know is that around 2010, there were just over 1,000 presentations to our services for methamphetamine, and they've increased nearly fourfold by 2013. So within a short period of time, we've got this fourfold increase in the number of episodes of care for our treatment services. So this is a real pressing issue for our service providers. Okay, that one is out of sequence, and I'll come back to it. The other thing that we looked at, and again thinking in terms of who are the vulnerable groups and populations in the community, when we looked at the national minimum data set, what we also identified was a disproportionate presentation of episodes of care amongst young Indigenous people. So the 15 to 19-year-olds, significantly more Indigenous presentations, and the 20 to 24-year-olds, significantly more Indigenous presentations. So you've got young Indigenous people presenting at a higher rate for care for specialised specialised methamphetamine care to our alcohol and drug services. So again, I'd really highlight that as an issue of concern to us. We then looked at the hospital data and say, okay, what's presenting to hospital and what do we need to be aware of in that regard? And the hospital data categorises presentations or separations in terms of stimulants, and in some instances we're able to break it down by methamphetamine. But what we saw is that, that should read 2009-2010, about 15% of all illicit drug presentations for hospitals or separations were from stimulants. But within 3 years that had nearly doubled to 27%. So in the hospital setting we're also seeing a substantial increase in problems, the manifestation of problems. See it a little bit more clearly here. Oops. You see it a little bit more clearly here in 2009, about 19% of methamphetamine presentations overall, stimulant presentations were methamphetamine. By 2013, that had increased to 35%. We also then looked to see what that looked like as an increase of hospital separations, and that's a 158% increase here if you follow that green line through from 2010 to 2013. A really substantial increase in hospital separations for stimulants. For poisonings due to psychostimulants, we saw a 41% increase during that period of time. And then for psychotic disorders, a 312% increase due to methamphetamines. So we couldn't separate that out in every instance. But again, between this short period of time, this really substantial and significant increase in the number of psychotic disorders that we're seeing in our hospital setting. What we also saw in this data, which is a little bit different to what I was showing you, or what we saw about the decreasing age of ICE users, the age profile of people presenting for psychotic disorders has actually been increasing. And so the average age shown here for the 2012-13 data in the top blue line, they're getting older. I'm not quite sure whether that's a result of having used methamphetamine for a longer period of time, or it's the nature of the way those groups are using it. But that is not quite consistent with the downward trend in age for ICE use overall. So there's some complexities underpinning that particular graph there that we need to look at. Some of the other considerations that I think are worth folding into the mix when we're trying to think about, well, what is happening around methamphetamine? I think it's really important for us to not see these issues, either the causes or our responses to methamphetamine or to ICE, in isolation. That we need comprehensive and holistic responses, as we always have done in the alcohol and drug sector, and we've worked very hard for several decades to take a very comprehensive approach. We also need to give some consideration to some of the other concurrent patterns of drug use. So it's quite intriguing that you're seeing these upward trends around methamphetamine in a really short period of time. In the same period of time, we've seen statistically significant decreases for risky alcohol use, except for small subgroups within that, but overall at the population level. And we've seen significant decreases for cannabis use. So this is an intriguing picture that we're confronted with. In terms of the complexity of drug and alcohol using behaviour, it's also worthwhile thinking about not only who uses these drugs and in what way, but what are the kind of concurrent patterns that are occurring? And we've known for a long time that there's been a well-established relationship between the use of stimulants of different sorts and alcohol. And so some of Amy Penny's work that was recently published on wide-awake drunkenness, where people quite deliberately use stimulants to allow them to drink longer, to party longer, to engage with the nighttime economy in a way that many younger people do these days that didn't occur perhaps a decade or more ago. But certainly high levels of stimulant use are associated with risky drinking in the nighttime economy. So when we're looking at these changing patterns that we're seeing and trying to understand who's using, and why people are using, and how they're using, we need to do so in this broader, more holistic way. The other potential speculation for us is in relation to cannabis, and that we know anecdotally, and we don't have good hard data on this, but much anecdotal data that indicates that where there's been a strong push to introduce drug testing in many areas, and particularly in workplaces, and Ken Pidd will speak specifically about this in a little while, that we know that there's been a shift away from using cannabis towards using methamphetamine, because the metabolites of cannabis, as you all know, stay in the system for up to a couple of weeks and are detected long after somebody's been using and long after there's any effect from the substance. So to avoid drug testing regimes, we know that many people have switched to a number of other different substances, and that includes the amphetamines. And so this may be one of many contributors to some of the changing shifts that we're seeing towards methamphetamine. And if that's the case, it raises important questions. Are we encouraging behaviours and policies that indicate to somebody that, or urge and create a motivation for somebody to move away from using potentially a less harmful drug towards using a more harmful drug? Are we actually contributing to some of that problem through our own policy changes? We don't have an answer to that. It's speculation, but these are important questions, I think, for us to ask. I think the other thing that when we're thinking about, what are the drivers and what are the contributors to this pattern that we're seeing, is to remind ourselves again of the first principles about, Drugs 101, about why people use. And it's really helpful for us to keep thinking in terms of those 3 P principles, that people use drugs for reasons that are purposeful, that they have really useful purposes in their lives. And around stimulants, it may be to engage in the nighttime economy, or it may be because you're a long-distance truck driver, or it may be for a variety of other reasons to help you fit in with your social group or whatever. But people also, and overridingly, use drugs because they're pleasurable. That's the second P. And the use of methamphetamine is associated with a really strong euphoric effect. And when people do not have sufficient things in their lives to counterbalance that degree of pleasure, it makes it more attractive to them. So that the pleasure component is extremely important. And we also know that many people use drugs at different points in times to mask or to deal with pain of different sorts. And that might be physical pain, it might be psychological pain. But again, important considerations for us to keep reminding ourselves of these key principles. So the implications of this kind of snapshot overview is that there are clear changes that are occurring, and these are changes that are occurring in other parts of the world as well, and there are huge external factors driving much of that. Some of these changes appear not to be moving in the same direction, so there's a complexity in terms of what the patterns of use look like and who the subpopulations are that are using in different ways and that might be experiencing different types and patterns of problems. But we also know quite clearly that this has created a tremendous demand on our treatment services. And I quite consciously included the national minimum data set and the hospital data, the hospital data, to emphasise how important it is for us to get a grasp on the reality of our workload, the demand on us, and how different many of the clients with methamphetamine-related problems might be to clients who had been using CNS depressants. Very challenging and very demanding for our services, and often will need much longer periods in treatment. So recognising the impost on the services and us, the workers involved, is crucial. But I'd also stress that we're dealing here with people, and we're not dealing with ice. We're dealing with people. We're dealing with people with complex needs, and we need to think in terms of what are the complexities underpinning every individual's particular circumstances. And as a result of that, we need to move towards much more targeted interventions, global, simplistic, mass media problem. The solutions aren't going to solve this particular problem. And the problems, again, I would stress, are experienced by people with these complex needs and concerns. And this is the tip of the iceberg that we're seeing only. And I've used this picture before that some of you would have seen. This is purportedly the iceberg that sank the Titanic. So I can't verify that, but I believe it to be the case. But if we think only in terms of dealing with ice or methamphetamine, we truly are missing the big picture in terms of what's happening in people's lives and in what's happening in terms of the complexity of alcohol and drug issues and the interrelatedness across a range of different issues. So I think it's beholden on all of us to work with all the different players, our funders, our policymakers, to ensure that we don't reduce our solutions to single issues and simplistic solutions, because this is a much more complex set of issues that we're dealing with. But I said at the outset, we are the experts in this area. We know our business extremely well. We know what alcohol and drug problems are about. We know what the evidence tells us about best practice and best ways about going about addressing them. So the challenge for us is to marry that together with our new understanding about what's happening with methamphetamine in Australia today. So thank you so much for your time.